Hi everyone, thank you. It's customary to start with an icebreaker, so I'd like to thank my wife for doing just that this weekend when she offered to cut my hair for me. And at one point I did look more like Mr. Potato Head than my good self. So this is not Breaking Bad. I am here to talk about Article 25. We are a 13-year-old international development organisation. You'll be glad to hear that Article 25 has nothing at all to do with Article 50, but actually it's about access to adequate shelter. And for us that means access to shelter where it's needed most, where communities are at their most vulnerable, whether that's because of a natural disaster like an earthquake or a tsunami, whether it's in the face of recovery from conflict, or whether indeed it's actually resilience in a very different kind of setting. We assume that resilience to disasters suggests a catastrophic event, but of course the pernicious problems of poverty do not strike in one big disastrous catastrophic event, but multiples of events on individuals and homes over many, many years. And it's one of those problems that we try to tackle by being a positive catalyst in those communities who are struggling to tackle their approach to resilience. So I'll touch on resilience in a variety of ways, and I'd like to also thank very much BRE Trust for their support to our small charity. We've mentioned the Sustainable Development Goals, but maybe I should step back briefly to talk about where we came from as an organisation. So a very eccentric and wonderful man called Maxwell Hutchinson, who's a past president of the RIBA, felt extremely frustrated by the lack of social impact that he felt the architectural practice in the UK and indeed in the West by simply not doing anything other than being driven by profit. And he felt that they should be using that skill, expertise and an art form essentially to help support communities that don't have access to design and construction excellence in the way that we might expect to find it in the UK. And him being a spiritual man, he was at Mount Sinai and he had this kind of vision of an organisation that would do something about that. And then he went back to London and did nothing at all about it for a couple of years, until he was caught up in the Boxing Day tsunami with his wife and very closely lost his own life and felt that that was it. He absolutely had to do something about what he had been thinking about for many years. So he went to another past president in Jack Pringle and said, I want to set up an organisation. It's to help those who need it most to design and build buildings that we would all be proud of. And Jack said, well, I'm only going to help you on two conditions. The first is that we're not just going to talk about it, we're actually going to do it. And the second is that we're going to do it just as professionally as we would for a commercial practice. And so 13 years on, we've now worked in 34 different countries. We've delivered over 90 projects. So we're very much a professional, do-driven organisation, and one I'm very proud to represent. There are more than half of the world lacking access to essential healthcare. We design and build schools, hospitals and clinics where health professionals can then deliver quality services to patients. And this is the Yangon General Hospital in Myanmar. We're working on a 20-year program to reinvigorate this hospital complex, which has over 400,000 patients passing through it every year. So a very complicated project that we're only a couple of years into delivering. 1 in 5 children worldwide don't have access to school. They simply don't go. So we build schools in those communities where they're needed most to create that inclusive educational environment that we all should expect. And poorly built buildings, of course, endanger people's lives. And this is a school that collapsed in Haiti in 2010. Fortunately, nobody was in the building at the time of its collapse, but of course that's not the case for many hundreds of thousands who were affected by that earthquake. And this is a school that we were involved in designing and rebuilding as a part of that disaster response. So I'm going to touch on a few different projects that we've worked on over the years, keeping resilience in mind, but trying to just pull on a few different threads with regards to that. So the first here is post-earthquake housing reconstruction in northern Pakistan. I think there are just over 60,000 people who were killed in this earthquake about 10 years ago, and about another 60 to 70,000 who were seriously injured, and many, many more who lost their homes. So what can we do to respond to that disaster, and what is appropriate to respond to that disaster? Because, like in this example, it's possible to get it very, very wrong, even though the intentions are very positive. And that simply is a waste of resources and doesn't provide people with what they need to recover from that disaster. Instead, it's better to think about what's normal here, what actually normally exists, what has stood the test of time, what has stood up against these earthquakes for many, many centuries, and learn from that vernacular, which maybe we've decided as humanity to forget when we've headed towards ambitions of development and growth. And maybe we're thinking more about glass and steel and concrete rather than thinking about how we could more effectively use some of those ancient construction techniques and apply them to modern day settings. And who should we work with? Disaster response tends to be that kind of almost 10-minute response from the world, where there's a huge, and rightly so, outpouring of love and support and finance to help people recover their lives and bring some kind of normality back to them. But what about day two? How can we encourage resilience within that community that gives them something positive as a legacy from that disaster? And in this instance, this is a family member who is building his own home. And in this project, we worked on 60 homes by simply building one with that local workforce. And then the family is building 59 more, using the materials that were available to them locally and on site. And those are the houses snaking up the hillside, all looking very unique because each family designed a house that was fit for their needs. So back to that school that we touched on a couple of minutes ago, and this is the Bosseron Tonnerre School in Pétionville in Haiti, which used to look like that, but within a matter of seconds had pancaked to collapse like this. So what happens next? Well, the local community pull out their fingers, and I'm making a point here as well of saying that the local workforce, often for us, is very much about involving women in the construction and reconstruction, and the economic freedoms that we can create by producing these types of projects. And we redeveloped a school on exactly the same site. It was seismically sensitive in its design so that it should withstand the same kind of earthquake as had brought the previous building down. And again, we used the local construction workforce and professionals. Wherever we can, we would rather not be needed than be needed at all. And we always spend time before we start to design buildings to understand who is available within the local community, available for workforce. That can include local architects, local engineers, construction professionals, and unskilled workers as well. And we design with the needs of the building and the needs of the people and its use of the building to create spaces that work well, that are comfortable, that are passively designed so that there's less requirement for electricity to keep them cool. There's natural lighting as much as possible. It helps with, of course, the environmental impact of the buildings too. So here are the children celebrating the opening of their own school, which they've been in now for nearly 2 years. And that's one of the classrooms in use. So for us, resilience isn't simply about creating greater resilience in the construction of the building and its resilience and resistance to drop in earthquakes. It's actually about encouraging resilience within that community. So I'm going to move on to Bethel School in Gorcy in Burkina Faso. One of the reasons is because we've also returned there recently with BRE's financial support for some post-occupancy evaluation research now that the school has been open since the tail end of 2014. So Burkina Faso is called the land of the upright people. It's on the west of Africa. It has a population of 20 million. And as you can see, there are a number of indexes that might suggest how that country and its communities are struggling. It's very reliant on subsistence agriculture. Not quite, but nearly half of its population are living with, under the poverty line, and the average number of years schooling doesn't even reach 2. So let's just have a bit more of a look at that. So in primary school, that's nearly 80% of the population getting access to education, but by the time it gets to secondary school, it drops to more like 30%. So this was an existing school site where there were simply not enough classrooms. They had to turn away 150 children in 2010. There was no space for vocational training. There were no rooms for the final 2 years of secondary school. So it was bursting at the seams, and it had a great reputation, but it wasn't meeting the needs of the local community. One of our approaches to our design and build projects is to involve the community right from the outset. And this is an example of doing just that. This is teachers ranking the different uses or needs of the school and debating amongst themselves what it is that they need. Of course, you would expect that they want more classrooms when they're having to turn away children, but it's things like sports facilities and a library. It's those types of, the science labs. It's those kind of ambitions about what they would like to do with their school in the coming years. And we then take account of that in our approach to designing what they need. And we involve everybody that we can gain access to in that early consultative process, so that we're not just building a school that meets the primary needs of that building. It's actually those secondary needs as well. Is there a need for fresh water that simply doesn't exist in the area? Could this be the place for a public marketplace? Could it be used as a safe space for women and girls? Can it be used for public ceremonies and weddings? Is there a need for sports provision as well? We also, as much as possible, try to use as locally sourced materials as we can. That keeps the costs of construction down. It means the costs of maintenance remain low, and it also means that those materials are available at the local marketplace should there be a need for reconstruction or additional construction later on from the initial build. I'd mentioned in passing that we work with a local workforce, and so we bring together skilled and unskilled workers. The purpose often is that for the unskilled worker, they could earn 2 or 3 times what they were prior to the construction of projects that we're involved in. And for them, that means that they're hopefully protecting their children away from work. They've got meaningful work for the rest of their working lives. And of course, it adds more economic freedom to their families, especially when you're producing opportunities for women to work in the construction workforce as well. Whether that's carpenters, electricians, bricklayers, we want to know who's interested in learning those skills and give them the opportunity to build it. And this is one of the completed classroom blocks in Gorsey. It's got a double-skinned roof, which is part of the passive design, which encourages air to pass through the roof space and pull heat away from the classrooms to make the learning environment more comfortable. So in terms of post-occupancy, these are the types of questions that we're now asking ourselves. We know that passive design works, but to what extent? And we'd like to be able to measure that and prove back to ourselves and to others that it is worth that bit of extra time and possibly expense in the construction of a building with 2 roofs rather than 1. So what are the actual air temperatures in that building, and how do they compare to other buildings on the same site? What does this relate to in terms of outdoor conditions and indoor conditions, and actually being able to teach throughout more months of the year because simply the temperature and humidity in the classrooms is more bearable than it would have been otherwise. Being able to work in low 30s Celsius temperatures might feel like it's too hot for us, but actually if you were working in 50 Celsius temperatures, it feels positively comfortable. How well are the buildings actually holding up? Is there anything that we need to do in terms of repair? Are there any other issues of maintenance that we should be aware of that we can help support this community with a few years on? But also, what's the economic and social impact of our work too? So this is anecdotal at the moment because we're putting together the research into a proper paper, but we found that within that workforce there were 2 who we got to meet who learned those construction techniques, and one of whom in particular who's created his own construction company and is working right across the country and into neighbouring countries and employing other people. So do they actually keep hold of those skills, and do they use them beyond the projects that we work on? And the answer is yes, invariably they do. Is there access to higher education more so than there was before? Is there vocational training going on? And again, we have seen people who have set up new businesses by being seamstresses or moving into horticulture and agriculture, and they've done so through these vocational training opportunities at this expanded school. has family income actually increased? Are there more women in the workforce? Has the attendance of girls in the school increased? And what can we apply from learning in one project to another? And here we are in Niger, and the client of this particular school is a former diplomat of the UN, and he went to visit the school in Gorcy and said he loved the design so much that he wanted to build exactly the same school in Niamey, the capital in Niger, to support his local community. So Niger is ranked right at the bottom of the league tables in the UN's Development Index. There are fewer than 10% of students who enroll in secondary education. Literacy rate is therefore understandably very low, and it has the highest birth rate in the world of over 7 children to every woman of childbearing age. So it's got a lot of things that cause a very, very challenging context for people to try to work, live, and essentially survive in, let alone thrive. In this instance, we worked with a stone that's called laterite, and I thought I'd just pause on this for a couple of minutes, really, because it's an amazing stone. It's plentiful. It exists around a tropic band across Asia, Africa, and Central and South America. It can be hand-cut from the ground, as you can see here, and its embodied energy is extremely low compared to other types of building material. And all that you need to do is leave it out in the air and sun for a few weeks, and it becomes a very robust, usable construction material. And it looks absolutely breathtakingly beautiful as well in its colour. And here's a master stonemason who's working on the construction of this school, who's teaching others stonemasonry in the process, as well as building the new classroom blocks, as you can see here. But I mentioned as well about the need to essentially maximise what we can. We want to try and make the most out of the construction process for social good. And this is a group of young women who are in, I suppose, the sixth form equivalent at this school, who over the course of their summer learnt a variety of construction techniques, building their own school, expanding their own school, and given certificates to celebrate the learning opportunity that they had with us. So I've probably rocketed through a bit quicker than the 20 minutes I had available, but I just wanted to finish by maybe saying that for us, I suppose the difference between a profit-driven organisation and a non-profit-driven organisation is that buildings aren't just a means to an end. For us, they're a just means to a just end. And I should have finished with an image that stays with me, which is hugely inspiring, of a woman called Grace, who is pushing a wheelbarrow across a construction site in Uganda, and she has a huge beaming smile on her face in spite of the baking hot sun. And it begs the question, why would somebody in that situation be so happy? And that's because she's a former child soldier. And former child soldiers in Uganda were predominantly forced, as part of their induction, at gunpoint to kill their own parents. They're also, many of them are sexually abused. And in this instance, Grace, out of shot, has a young child in the shade of a tree. And the reason she's smiling is because she's building a learning centre, and she has a dream of becoming an accountant, something that maybe we wouldn't necessarily dream of here. But actually, that's a sign of the fact that you've gained access to education and gone right the way through university and into formal education, which continues into continued professional development. And Grace is smiling because of her future in spite of such a hopeless and horrible past. So for us to be able to do anything to support and catalyse opportunities like that for people like Grace at any scale, then we'll always do all that we can to help them. Thank you very much.